it back to Neil, who got us going there just before the great spirit of Mr. Danluc appeared on the screen. So we had a lot of challenges there. He sounded quite bullish, I thought, or quite robust about what he'd be able to do. Do you share that feeling?
Well, I've still got the scars from when the UK went through this. We had a mythical investor called Sid. So when we had privatizations, the public you had to have the confidence of the public for that privatization that it wouldn't go wrong. Now, I heard at lunch that 7 of the 11 IPOs up to 2011 in Poland failed. So you have to have sufficient confidence from the public. You have to take the public with you. So I'd be interested to hear from the room, actually, if you feel, from what I've heard, the public aren't confident about privatization.
That's a very good question. Why don't we throw it out to the floor? Who's got a strong view, pro or con, privatization or anything arising from it? Anyone like to come back on Neil's point? Someone must have a view on privatization. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
I have a comment, probably a bit controversial. Privatization is great and should take place, and in my opinion, should be done at whatever price it's possible, just to bring, better governance, more efficiency, and private capital, and to be kind of, the example for, others that are still sitting or waiting on the sidelines that, things can be done in Ukraine. But having said that, in my opinion, if you look at, what the state owns, we're not talking about, much money. And some of the key privatizations in the energy sector are unfortunately, they're meaningless without structural reforms in the energy sector that a lot of the donors are working on. Because effectively what the state is trying to sell, and we've been, in this situation before, what the state is trying to sell is officially not making any money. So by regulation, if we're talking about electricity distribution, electricity distributors are not allowed to make money. So, if somebody can tell me, one good reason why a serious foreign investor will seriously look at something like that, well, the answer wasn't found last time around, which was in the beginning of 2000. I was lucky enough to work with my colleagues with Electricity de France. And at that time, instead of lengthy regulation, a one-off decision was made that guaranteed a return on the purchase price to investors. So, just to conclude that, privatization is good, but in my opinion, is not going to move the needle. It's very important. I think, what we need to prove that, Ukraine is an improving story, to show people that the reforms are not only, only painful and, are the bad word. We need to, do things in a timely manner and bring as much investment, capital investment into the country as possible in a meaningful way, so it restarts the growth. The good thing is that we're starting from a low base has been discussed before. Get to 6-7% GDP growth that Mr. Danluc was talking about, and a number of other experts are talking about, is not that difficult and realistic, and it can be done in a sustainable, structured way. Just put the things or the figures into perspective. The much talked about agriculture. The state is sitting on 12 million hectares of land, state-owned. The average rent that is paid by the private sector on 1 hectare is $150, roughly. So even if you round up, just on the state-owned land that can be sold without, exploding the minds of populists, the state is sitting on 15 billion conservatively if you use a cap rate of 10%. This is without kind of the GDP multiplier and all these wonderful things. The energy sector, the good thing is that the gas prices have been liberalized, market level. Investors want to get in, and if we market this well enough and set, the clear rules or continue to adhere to clear rules on pricing, we're easily talking about, 3 billion that can be and will be put into exploration over, a pretty short period of time, 5 years. And, I can go on and give you, other examples and figures, but just think about it, just think about the figures that I mentioned and, compare it with $100 billion GDP that this country has at the moment. 18 billion, roughly, give or take, gross reserves of the national bank, and the incremental borrowing of 1 billion that we just talked about, and total IMF program of 15 billion that in theory can be extended. So those are big numbers that can move the needle. They will move the needle, and then we can be in the territory, if not negative, but then much lower interest rate or cost of capital.
Thank you very much. Coming from the other end of the panel, I do want to just broach the question, which I'm very surprised hasn't come up most of the day, which is a good chunk of the country is mired in a conflict, albeit something of a frozen conflict. What impact do you think this has on investment in Ukraine? Obviously, the situation is very different if you're looking at Lviv compared to looking at the Donbass. There are lots of different economies within Ukraine. No one has sort of mentioned the rather obvious point that has created uncertainty on the ground. I mean, Timothy, is this something that you think weighs strongly in your calculations or not so much?
It's clearly a factor, the relationship with Russia. It would certainly help the investment case if there was some kind of normalization in terms of the relationship with Russia. And obviously, it is a hot conflict. There is a continuing conflict. And as we saw earlier in the year with re-escalation and then blockade, it can be damaging at particular points along the border, and it can have impacts in terms of the real economy. But in the end, I think the level of intensity of the conflict in the east is manageable for the broader Ukrainian macro. And in a way, I think it's no excuse for policymakers in Ukraine now. In fact, I would argue, I mean, if you think about it, the global environment around Ukraine is pretty favorable. Very cheap financing, reflected in the Eurobond issue. For whatever reason, Putin has decided to take something of a step back in terms of the East. Ukraine has this window of opportunity to implement reform and drive ahead to make the country much more durable, because I think inevitably, or my view anyway, is Putin is not finished with Ukraine. There will be further pressure points between the relationship between Russia and Ukraine needs to build up its economic and military defenses. And I think messing around with these structural reforms that are not rocket science, that are obvious, that need to be done, that have been talked about for years, I think there's no excuse for policymakers. Why are you messing around on pension reform, land reform, anti-corruption, business environment? Get it done, move on, because you will be tested in the future.
Gösta, do you share that view, sort of bracing view, but that the conflict, in a sense, is not an excuse for pushing further on reform? Yes, absolutely.
Yes, I completely share that, and I think the moment is now to implement these reforms. And Minister Daniluk said that we should not judge Ukraine by its history, but it's difficult not to. And I think it's important to prove us wrong now by actually going ahead and implementing what Tim said. These are obvious reforms. They need to be done sooner rather than later. And I have a hard time finding any plausible arguments not to do it.
Anything else? Anyone would like to ask any questions from the floor? I think we'll go to our last 10 minutes, so slightly closing arguments from the panel. But you've either been an extremely well-behaved or quiet or tired audience. Is there anything else anyone would like to ask? Any challenges you'd like to put to us? If not, we can make them work a bit harder. But it's always nice to hear from you. Silence. The most content audience I've ever addressed. Thank goodness. Someone's find something to object to. Hello.
I felt the responsibility to ask a question.
Thank you very much. Bailed me out.
I wonder, actually, I did have one question when I was thinking about when I heard the discussion about the privatization. And Ukraine went through a couple of privatization before, and it didn't work that well. So again, it goes back to the question how much it is a new Ukraine and how much the privatization when it's done now will be different from privatization in 2000s. So you operate on Ukrainian financial market. So you think that we are already in a situation where privatization can proceed and bring reasonable results, long-term investors, reasonable price, and not what happened 10 or 15 years ago?
Who'd like to go first on that? Makar, do you have a word on that? And then, because we just heard from Timothy, but anyone feel free to jump in. Makar, why? I would have asked exactly the same. Why sitting there? What's the proof that a privatization will go well?
I guess it's a question, how do you define, it goes well. When you speak to a bureaucrat, probably they will say, well, it's all about the price. And, it's never good enough. And it's not, it's never good enough, for a private sector, for a company owner that does an IPO. It always could be better. Where I'm coming from, I think, given that the pricing for privatization would be low in any case, so, it's not gonna, as I said, in my opinion at least, move a needle, then we all should concentrate on bringing proper people, branded investors, if you want to, branded strategic investors to buy those companies. And, I would argue that the price is secondary, if not, unimportant at all. But, if we're talking about branded investors, they want to be given a reason why they should at least, start spending time on looking at something. And my argument was that, everybody talks about the state-owned enterprises, but in terms of assets that are of interest or could be of interest to branded strategic investors are not that many. And in my opinion, the core assets that might be of interest are in the energy sector. But, as I said before, if by definition you're not allowed to make any money, why would you buy it? And why would you spend time looking at it?
Who else would like to jump in? Yes.
I'd just like to add something, and I'd like to reconnect to the previous panel where I think there were two very good points that were made. The first one was that the majority of these state-owned enterprises are loss-making, but that can be changed. A problem right now with a lot of these state-owned enterprises is governance, and that can be improved, and it can be improved by putting in place independent supervisory boards that can hold the executive management to account and improve efficiency in these enterprises. The other thing also related to this is a point that Katarina Rashkova made, that privatizing or improving the state-owned enterprise sector and privatizing is also an anti-corruption measure. And I think there are overwhelmingly good reasons to start to address this oversized sector, which is about 20% of GDP, employing more than 1 million people. and start to have a good plan for how to downsize. And I think in key to do this, and I think the question was referring to the bad experience of the 1990s and the privatizations at that time. And I think the solution to that is to have an open, transparent, and market-based process for the privatizations. And by having that, I think a lot of these concerns can be addressed.
Neil, convinced?
Yes and no. I mean, in terms of the price, as I don't know this country, this is my first visit, but I understand the amount of equity you have, not priced, but in terms of land and property, it's undervalued. There's a huge richness to this country. So I would just come back to my point earlier, which is if you go too fast and you don't have sufficient governance, that if you don't take the people with you, you're going to misprice it, you're going to have lots of winners and lots of losers, and you're going to have all the problems that Jonathan Ondrej talked about earlier, which is you're going to raise inequality, you're not going to have sustainable growth. So I would say get the reforms right first and take the people with you.